Good afternoon. Very welcome. A lot of familiar faces here again. For those of you, anybody here first time in person here? I think so. For those of you who don't know, I'm Chris Bosley. I'm the president of the museum. And normally I just do the introductions, but today you get to listen to me for a while. This thing doesn't really stay up very well.
No, is it working or?
I don't know, I'll try and talk loud and hopefully explode. So I get to introduce myself today, which is somewhat unusual. But for those of you who are following, we are part of the Motor Cities Heritage Area Passport Program. So we have the passports, you get stamped, and you get if you get a certain number of stamps, you get a letter from the governor or something fancy on this one. But it's just, this is nice because it really is just a guide to a lot of the automotive-related museums in the state of Michigan. There's some really cool museums that you may not be aware of. So if you don't have one, you can grab this one, or we have it over in the gift shop. And then we also have this one, which actually just came out this week. It's brand new. For those of you who may not be aware, this is the bicentennial celebration for Macomb County. So Macomb County is officially 200 years old this year. And there's going to be a whole bunch of fun and exciting things going on in the county to celebrate that. And one of the things we're doing is this is our passport program. And if you get all 7 little boxes stamped from different museums, you get 7 stamps from one museum, that means cheating. You get a free meal from one of the Culvers in Macomb County. So if you like Culvers, you get a chance for some free food. So once again, we have these in the gift shop for everybody to pick up. My usual advertisements. We have the upcoming events out on the table. We have just added, actually yesterday we added a February speaker, Dennis Skupinski, who is, he's actually the chairman of the Michigan World War I Centennial Commission. He will be speaking about World War I stories from the home front. He operates kind of a cool little museum down in Grass Lake. Check it out. He's got some nice World War I stuff down there. But he will be up here on February 25th. First 2 weekends in February, we'll be having our used book and media sale. Please come by, and we've got a lot of books. We had a lot of books donated over the winter, so there's going to be a huge sale. And please come and buy some so I don't have to put them away. March 11th, we will have the Michigan War Dog Memorial people here talking about their project. And then we also have another book sale in May. And for those of you that are war gamers, we will have one of our annual war game weekends on January 26th through 28th. It's all board-based war games. It's kind of fun. Just kind of come out here and see what's going on. So we'll go right into our presentation now, since I don't have a way to introduce myself. So, today we'll be talking a little bit about the events that lead up to the invasion of North Africa and the Casablanca Conference. We're not really going to go real deeply into the military side of it. We're going to be looking more at the political aspects of it and some of the things that were going on. It's a fascinating story, and any part of this story we could break down and probably do a 1 or 2 hour presentation on it alone. So I'm going to try to avoid going too deeply into the rabbit holes and kind of stay at the 30,000 foot level and give us an overview. But so 75 years ago today, January 14th, 1942, or 43, I'm sorry, the Casablanca Conference began. And Churchill and Roosevelt and Henry Girard and a very reluctant de Gaulle were all met in a hotel, the Anfa Hotel in Casablanca, and they discussed a number of things about the status of the war. The Casablanca Conference is probably best known for being the point where they settled on the unconditional surrender decree, that there would be no conditional surrender, there would be no independent surrenders. They talked about the European invasion and the planning of it, and they also discussed the status of the French, whether they're the free, who actually spoke for the French, the Free French. That's really kind of what we're going to talk about here in general. And they also discussed some of the post-war status of the North African colonies. So a little over 75 years ago, so back in November 1942, so about 75 years ago and 3-4 months, 33,000 American troops boarded 102 ships at Hampton Bay in Virginia, and they didn't know where they were going. They had no clue. And once they got out to sea, people came around and started handing them this lovely little book. And then they knew. They kind of had an inkling of what was going on. They were heading to North Africa. And this is the very first paragraph of this book. The majority were taking new parts of the world, and people are strange and foreign. But the key sentence is down here at the bottom. Furthermore, are welcomed by the inhabitants of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunis are not known at this time. Get that arrow out of the middle of the screen. Oops. Wrong button. So the background behind all of this is, obviously, the Germans invaded France in June 1940, and the French surrendered after 42 days of fighting. And what happened is they split France into two. There was the German occupied France, and there was the Vichy France under General Marshal Pétain. And so you basically had two elements of France at this point. There's like this nice, interesting use of a meme here. Pétain was a big hero from the First World War. He was a very well-respected Frenchman, and he would go on to become, labeled a collaborator, pro-German, and lived long enough to see himself become the villain. Second in command of the Vichy was Laval. You can see what Time Magazine thought of Laval. So one of the things is the French signed the armistice with the Germans. The Germans occupied the northern half of France. Vichy was in the southern half of France. The French, at the end of the fighting, had 92,000 dead, 200,000 wounded, and 1.5 million Frenchmen as POWs of the Germans. One of the kind of key things to remember is that part of the armistice was the French POWs that were in German hands would remain POWs for the duration of the fighting. So they kind of condemned these French soldiers to be prisoners of war for the next 4 or 5 years. And there was really no hope for them. And then most of these things kind of progress later that kind of cements that. One of the other parts of the armistice was that the French had to pay the Germans 400 million francs per day for the honor of being occupied. So it was not a very good deal for the French, but they were really kind of backed into a corner. Now Laval was second in command, and he was very pro-Nazi, he was pro-German, and everybody in the West, on the Allied side, was very convinced that Laval would cozy up to the Germans, and really the Vichy would switch over to the German side of the war. Pétain had other ideas, and he made the Allies and the Western powers portrayed him as being a somewhat feeble old man who was being played by the Germans. And he may not have been quite as dumb as he thought he was, because he kind of kept control. But you have an image problem, but even Hitler calls you a dirty democratic politician who doesn't believe in what he says. So Laval was not a particularly popular person on any side. He came in and out of power a couple of times. And one of the things we'll see is that the Vichy government was extremely confused and it was very chaotic. And that was one of the things that kind of played into the whole thing. General Maxime Weygand is a very important player in this whole game. He was another World War I hero. He takes command of the German forces or the French forces after the Germans attack. He goes out and he tours the front lines. And once he does another, you can spend a whole hour just talking about, he goes out there and he gets stuck. He can't get back to Paris because of the Germans have already come on behind them. But he finally makes it back and he realizes that it's lost. We cannot win this war with the Germans at this point. We have botched it so badly that the battle is over. So he is one of the people that really lobbies to have Paris declared as an open city. And the Germans march into Paris unopposed. He is one of the people that really lobbies for the Vichy settlement. And even though it's not very popular, but he quarrels with Laval incessantly. He does not like Laval, and he argues with him and he fights with him. And in the end, Pétain sends him to North Africa to kind of get him out of the picture and it's kind of exile. The Germans are not at all pleased that he's been sent to North Africa because they believe that in North Africa he was going to make trouble and set up a pro-Allied government, which he sort of tries to. So the whole foreign policy situation is very sticky. Vichy is technically an independent country at this point in time. It is the surviving France. And the United States government recognizes France, or Vichy France, as the official French government. We'll talk a little bit of map action here. So trying to give you an image. So occupied France is up here, obviously England's up there. And then that's Vichy, and then Vichy controls, essentially Vichy controls all of the French colonial holdings around the world. That was one of the things that was part of the Vichy-German armistice, was the Germans allowed the French to maintain control of all their colonial holdings. They also allowed the French to maintain control of the French Navy, which was a very modern Navy at that point in time. The Germans were really hoping that the Vichy would come over and bring the Navy with them. And of course the Allies were hoping that the Free French, would come over and bring the Navy with them. But primarily the Allies were more concerned with keeping the French Navy out of the German hands. And the notion of hundreds of thousands of French colonial troops suddenly marching under the German flag was not really very appealing to us. Why was America really kind of concerned about this? Because the French also controlled holdings in the Caribbean. The yellow, there's over here, down here. So there were French colonial holdings, and there's also one up in Canada, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Saint-Pierre and Colomb. I know I butcher a lot of French words, so you're going to have to bear with me. But, so all of these things kind of, Cordell Hull is, Secretary of State at that time, he's got the Monroe Doctrine sitting on his desk. And, there's some questions. We're also going to kind of bump into the Spanish here a little bit, so I wanted to kind of give you an awareness. Not all of Morocco was controlled by France. The green is the French protectorate, and this pink area here is the Spanish protectorate. So So you have Spanish Morocco, which you will notice, and Tangier is an open city. Tangier is marked as an international city. So there really nobody controlled it. But you will notice that so you have Britain over here controlling Gibraltar, but across the other side of the Straits of Gibraltar is controlled by the Spanish, who, at that point in time, were ruled by Franco, who was a fascist government. And that was one of the other concerns is if the Vichy were to follow the Germans, Franco would very likely throw his hat into the ring on the German side. So there's a huge political game going on here, trying to figure out will Franco stay neutral? Will Franco become part of the Germans? Will the Vichy stay neutral? Will they go allied? Will they join up with the Germans? So everybody's got their little political fingers going in here, and it's quite a story in it. And we can dive into some of the individual people. And James Bond, he was nothing. Some of the people that were running around over here are just incredible. So the Vichy crowd, from the French point of view, technically the French have no military. Under the terms of the armistice, they have to demobilize the military. They demobilized the French Foreign Legion. They demobilized the French Foreign Legion by sending most of them to Casablanca area, or to Morocco, and Algeria, where they sort of go into the back part of the country and get rolled in with the Sultan's bodyguard. And they stash tons of military equipment into the back parts of Algeria and Morocco, because they know that because there's a German armistice committee that is also in Africa, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. But they are there to make sure the French don't get up to no good. But they kind of stick to the coast. They don't go inland, because you go inland and suddenly the German Armistice Commission runs into some Berbers and doesn't come home. So they kind of stuck to the coast where it was safe. So the French knew this, and the French having ruled Morocco for as long as they did, and Algeria, were able to stash a lot of military power inland and kind of hide it away. Once again, the German POW, or the French POWs in Germany, was another big issue. They were essentially hostages, and the Germans used them repeatedly as bargaining chips. The French did still control the Navy. Most of it was in Toulon. Some of it was in Casablanca Harbor. The battleship Jean Bart, which was not finished yet, becomes a major player in the American invasion. Not in our favor, but it comes out and it fights. The French still controlled the colonial holdings, and they realized that was a very important bargaining chip on their side, that they could use that to play both sides. From the German point of view, the French Navy needed to be kept out of Allied hands. Preferably, it should come over to German hands. French colonial troops were fighting for the Allies, were a huge threat. And that realization would eventually come true in some invasion of southern France. And the German bargaining chip was a plan called Attila. Attila was the plan for the invasion and occupation of Vichy. So the Germans had forces along the border of Vichy that were prepared to invade and take over Vichy at a moment's notice. So that was always a big threat over the French heads, over the French people's heads. So what does the United States stand on this? The United States recognized Vichy diplomatically. We adopted a Vichy-friendly stance, and we had an ambassador there, we had a consulate there. And one of the things we did, especially in the North African colonies, is we took over representation of any British subjects that were trapped behind the lines and spoke on their behalf. In particular in Casablanca, the Americans the Americans actually had a very, very small embassy in Casablanca. And one of the things they did is they took over the British consulate, just because they needed more space. Because one of the things that you find when you look at this is that the movie Casablanca is actually really accurate. There's just all these people that are flowing into Casablanca and Algiers and Tangier for that matter, looking for ways out of occupied Europe. You know, a lot of Jews, what's interesting is a lot of Spanish Republicans are hiding there, and you know, they get caught, they get sent they get sent back to Spain, and Franco kills them. So you have Spanish Republicans, you have communists, you have Jews, you have all these monarchists, you've got people from the former, the East Bloc, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austrians. They're all flowing in there, and they're all trying to figure out how to get out. So the American consulate is overwhelmed. They have these people, they're trying to figure out how to grant them visas, and the key is that everybody wants to get to Lisbon. And from Lisbon, you can go anywhere in the world. But the only place you could really get to you had to get from Casablanca to Tangiers, and then from Tangiers to Lisbon, and then from Lisbon, hopefully to the United States, South America, Central America, or anywhere else. So Winston was a realist. Mr. Churchill told the Americans, he encouraged the Americans to maintain diplomatic relationships with the Vichy. And his idea is that the Americans, as long as the Americans recognized Vichy and were supportive of them, and they would keep them out of the Germans' hands. And the big thing is that the Germans really, really wanted to get into Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. They really wanted to get bases in there. They were hoping they could set up logistic supply lines for Rommel's Africa Corps that did not involve the Libyan ports. And there was a lot of back and forth. They would make a bunch of demands to the Vichy. The Vichy kind of would drag their feet, and then it actually got to the point where Pétain would just go up to Hitler and say, "No, I'm not doing that." And what really worked out for the Vichy is that by this point in time, the Germans were pretty much preoccupied with the invasion of the Soviet Union. So they didn't really want to. So Pétain and the Vichy were able to kind of play the Germans because the Germans were busy chasing their tails in the Russian steppe. So Pétain would threaten the Americans and say, if you break ties with us, we will be thrown inescapably into the arms of the Axis. So there's back and forth. Who exactly is playing who? The Americans thought that we were trying to keep the French holdings away from the Germans. Pétain was really using the Americans to keep everything away from de Gaulle, because we'll talk about de Gaulle a little bit later, but nobody liked him. The French really didn't like him at all. And we'll come to him a little bit later. So there's Waverly Root was a historian who wrote a series of books called The Secret History of the War, and he referred to the American relationships with the Vichy as a grudging and reluctant ceding to logic. Because in the public opinion, the Free French under de Gaulle, who had set up this government in London, represented the France that didn't give up, represented the France that was anti-German, represented a France that we could appreciate. The Vichy were portrayed as these terrible collaborators and Nazi sympathizers. And so the public opinion was very much anti-Vichy and pro-de Gaulle, which didn't really mirror the political side of things once you got deeper into the undercurrents. But you also have to remember that Waverly Root was a Gaullist. So when you read his books, you have to take a little bit of grain of salt with a lot of it, because he was very, very much a Gaullist. You should listen to historiography. You always got to pay attention to the leanings of the authors. So here's our Free French guys. There's our buddy, Charles de Gaulle. That's what Roosevelt thought of de Gaulle. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote this in her memoirs, actually, that she often heard Franklin Roosevelt say that he thought he had the makings of a dictator. And she also said that she went on to write in her memoirs that, I never heard Franklin say that he had changed his mind about him as a person. I do not think that between them there ever was any real understanding. If you really go into it, if you start looking, especially like there's the telegrams that went back and forth between Churchill and Roosevelt, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt hated de Gaulle. I'm not really sure why, but he did. He really, really hated de Gaulle. Churchill, on the other hand, tolerated de Gaulle. De Gaulle and Churchill went through that dark period together. You know, the fall of France and the setting up of the Free French government and the Battle of Britain. Churchill and de Gaulle experienced that together. Roosevelt didn't have that. So Churchill tolerated him. Churchill defended him. I think Churchill realized he was a wild card. Roosevelt called de Gaulle Churchill's bad boy. But those two kind of went to bat for each other, and Roosevelt was definitely on the other side of the fence. But the Free French had set up a government in London, and they really wanted to get political recognition. So they sent this guy, kind of a wheezy-looking little guy, but René Pleven goes to Washington, D.C. to represent the Free French. And the American State Department kind of waffles back and forth. And one of the things you will learn at this point in time is there were spies everywhere. Everybody was following everybody. Everybody was ratting on everybody. It is amazing. When we come back and we look at this period of time, you know, through history, you get this whole everybody was playing and pitching for the same team, and there was all kinds of crazy stuff going on just below the surface. So the Vichy find out that Pleven has been sent to Washington, D.C., and they send their people out and they start feeding the media. They didn't have Facebook and public and all that good stuff. They went out and they just started feeding the media. And they wanted to portray de Gaulle as radicals, revolutionaries, and probably communists. You know, they still had some Red Scare at that point. So the State Department was very doubtful as to whether or not the French actually had any real respect for de Gaulle, and they turned him down. Said, sorry, we're not recognizing you as the French government. That's Vichy. Vichy is the French government. You're something else. Then there are two episodes that happen in the political arena, political and military arena, that really kind of cement the distrust of the Free French on the American side. And the first one is the Dakar episode. So Dakar is one of the French colonial holdings in Africa. It's over here. You can see it's a very commanding location for this part of the Southern Atlantic. So there was this thought, I don't really talk about this a little bit, the French, the Germans would come over and join, and the Vichy would join the Germans. But one of the things that they thought was that because of the location of Dakar, the Germans wanted to use it as a submarine base, as a U-boat base. And there was a lot of thought, and there was some evidence to suggest that the Vichy were allowing the Germans to use Dakar, and in particular the Vichy, or the French naval vessel Jules Verne, which was a submarine tender, to resupply and refuel U-boats operating in the Southern Atlantic. So the British decide that they're going to launch something called Operation Menace. And they're going to go and they're going to take the car by force from the French. So 23 September 1940, the Free French and the British launch a combined op, and they go to take the car from the Vichy. And Harold Nicholson, who was part of the Parliament, and he was actually went on to become very important in the intelligence community later. He wrote this kind of sums up what happened. The British and the Free French arrived at the car, and the Vichy are waiting for them. They knew they were coming. They had reinforced the port, and it was a dismal failure. The British and the Free French retreat with their tails between their legs. But one of the repercussions of this is the British always blamed the Free French for the failure. They were convinced that, and probably rightly so, that the Free French headquarters in London was filled with spies. And they were probably right. And that's probably where the leak came from. But one of the big things that comes out of this is that when they start planning for the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, they specifically are told to leave the Free French and de Gaulle out of it. So de Gaulle actually doesn't learn about the invasion of North Africa until the night before. So he's a little bit annoyed. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The second thing that happened is Saint-Pierre, my French is
Nicolas.
Nicolas.
Yeah.
Nicolas.
Yeah, something like that.
So it's a small French island that's up there off of St. John's Bay. And it's right there in the middle of the North Atlantic convoy route. A lot of the ships that were Maine. So a lot of the ships, if you follow the northern routes of the supply convoys that were going between the North American continent and England, they kind of passed through here. So, and then the ones that were going to the Soviet Union for sure. The Vichy have a radio station on this island, and they're broadcasting pro-Vichy propaganda, pro-German propaganda, in French, and they're targeting the French-Canadian population. And they're hoping that the French-Canadians will rise up, because if the French-Canadians and the Canadians are fighting, maybe that takes the Canadians away from the war. And if the French-Canadians are successful, next thing you know, the United States and Canada are fighting with each other. So they are trying to incite this, the French-Canadians into rebellion. And the transatlantic cable also passed through there. And there was some suggestion or some evidence to suggest that the Vichy had brought the transatlantic cable up and had tapped into it. And they were also broadcasting to the German submarines operating in the area every time they saw a convoy go by. So the Canadians proposed this plan to invade the island, destroy the radio station, occupy it. And the Americans were like, yeah, that's cool, we can deal with that. And all was like, no, this ain't good at all. So on December 22nd, 1941, and look at the date, so this is right after Pearl Harbor. Free French, small task force of Free French vessels sails from Canada, where they're operating from, and shows up at the island and lands with absolutely no resistance. And then the next day they launch a plebiscite, and the island votes overwhelmingly to join the Free French. Admiral Lucet broadcasts this message to the French, and the French they agree. They join. They have a vote. All this stuff is lovely. And in the eyes of the world, right after, there's not a whole lot of good news in December of 1941 from the Allied perspective. And suddenly you have this: the Free French have gone and they have reclaimed a piece of territory from the bad guys. They've smacked them down. I mean, this is a great thing, right? So this, I always thought this is the flagship of their task force.
Corvette.
Yeah, it's a Flower class Corvette that they got from the British. But that's the Admiral's flagship. Little Corvette. But you know, this is de Gaulle that did this. So Franklin Roosevelt and Cordell Hull, we can't have this. So Cordell Hull invokes the Monroe Doctrine. And there was the Havana Conference of 1940, said that belligerent countries, this was sort of one of the conferences that they held to try and figure out what would happen in North America. And they said that, you know, belligerent nations couldn't use force to transfer property in our hemisphere. And the Americans basically tell the Free French, you got to give that island back. And the Americans and the Canadians are going to occupy it. And well, we all know the French. You know, the French would be like, de Gaulle in particular. De Gaulle was kind of a proud, stubborn dude. And they're like, no, this is it. And de Gaulle said, this is an internal French matter. Stay out of it. It's not your problem. And that was pretty much the end of it. But, like I said, the Americans, most Americans had no idea who Charles de Gaulle was at that point in time. But all of a sudden in the news, they have this story about this guy who has dealt a small victory to the Allied side, and now we're trying to tell him, no, we got to go back on that. And public opinion was very confused. And one of the things is Cordell Hull goes on the radio and refers to de Gaulle as the so-called Free French, which the Free French grab a hold of with both hands and use it, you know, as a propaganda tool. So what do you mean so-called Free French? We just reclaimed a piece of property from the Axis, and now you're telling us that we're not even, you know. So it becomes a real political firestorm. And one of the repercussions is that the Americans, Cordell Hull, and Franklin Roosevelt and the American government, they're embarrassed by this. They tried to invoke the Monroe Doctrine, and this French lieutenant who suddenly said, no, go away. So they're embarrassed. And even Churchill sends a cable to de Gaulle and says, you know, congratulations, but you probably pissed off the Americans, and maybe that wasn't such a good thing to do. But he did good. So the Allies, so this is kind of gives you a little bit of some of the political random that goes on before we decided to invade North Africa. So the Allies had decided that the first major American operation of the war will be the invasion of North Africa. The American strategists, there was always the Germany first thing, and once again, there's a thing that we could spend a whole hour just talking about that. But essentially, they had all agreed on Germany first. They thought the Germans posed the bigger threat. If they were successful in knocking England out of the war, the war in Europe would become a quagmire. If they succeeded in knocking England out of the war, there's a possibility that the French, that the Vichy and the Spanish might have flipped. So they really kind of concluded that Germany was important. They wanted to open the second front to placate the Soviets. Stalin. There's kind of a really cool, there's a cool book called The Secret, there's actually several books called The Secret History of World War II, but there's one called The Secret History of World War II. It's just a compilation of all the telegrams that went back and forth between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And one of the things, if you read them, is Stalin is continuously, when are you going to open the second front? When are you going to take some pressure off of us? When are you going to open the second front? The Allies, the Americans and the British and the Canadians realized there was no way they could launch a cross-channel invasion into France in 1940, in 42, and even 43 was questionable. That's really what Stalin wanted. Stalin wanted them to invade France and hit them on the other side. But everybody was like, really can't do that. We don't have the logistics behind it. Churchill wanted the North African operation. The American politicians were kind of in favor of the North African operation. The American generals and general staff thought it was a horrible idea. They wanted nothing to do with it. Churchill, and that's another thing that amazes me, is how much Churchill traveled during the war. I mean, he was in Moscow, he was in Washington. Churchill came to Washington, D.C. in June of 1942. This is actually his second trip to Washington. He was there over Christmas of 41 after Pearl Harbor to strategize with Roosevelt. But he comes back in June of 42 specifically to pitch the North African invasion. And they went back there, and they went back and forth and kind of hugged. One couple things happened in that time period that kind of cements it. One, while Churchill and Roosevelt are meeting in the White House, Churchill gets news that Tobruk falls. So the British had just lost the port in Libya to the Germans. So this was a huge loss for the African war, and it posed a threat to the Suez Canal, the oil fields. If the Germans were able to come around, take Egypt, take the Suez, get the Arabs to revolt, and come up and join up and go through Turkey, and then hit the Soviets from the bottom as well. Today, these all sound kind of ridiculous, but back then, at that point in time, they're like, these are all what ifs. So Tobruk falls, and that kind of puts Egypt in danger. And one of the other things that happens in June of 1942 is Midway. The American victory at Midway takes the Japanese off the offensive. And the American victory at Midway allows us to really view the Pacific War from the standpoint of a defensive operation. The Japanese have really kind of been taken out of the offensive war. They lost their carriers. It was a huge victory for us. Had Midway gone the other way, which it could have, you probably would not see Operation Torch happening. We'd be more concerned about defending Hawaii at that point in time. But the victory at Midway allowed us to come around and really do Germany first. So there was a ton of debate that went back and forth, back and forth. And if you think about it, so they started really planning in June. It wasn't until September that they finalized where the landings were going to happen. And then the landings happened in November. And for those of you that are familiar with the Second World War, think about the planning that went into Overlord for D-Day. I mean, this happened, a 6-month period of time. And we weren't launching a cross-channel attack. We launched an attack basically across the ocean in this very, very short period of time, which kind of explains some of the confusion that happens a little bit later. But Churchill was very much in favor. Churchill was very much in favor of an internal Mediterranean attack. He wanted the landings to occur on the Mediterranean side of the Straits of Gibraltar. The Americans thought it should be on the ocean side because they thought Casablanca and those ports would allow a better supply point without having to navigate through the Straits of Gibraltar where you had the Spanish watching you. And Winston Churchill and Roosevelt entered into this, because Roosevelt then returned to London, and Eisenhower referred to it as a transatlantic essay contest, where Churchill and Roosevelt go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth over where the landing should be. And honestly, with Churchill's background in amphibious operations at Gallipoli, he probably should have kept his nose out of it, because he obviously wasn't particularly bright when it comes to these things. But so they settled on a compromise. And once we'll get to the map a little bit later, you'll see that there were landings actually on both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar. It was agreed that the United States would lead the landings. Now, why? Because the French, by this point in time, didn't like the British. They didn't like the British any more than they liked the Free French. There were a couple of incidents that had occurred at that point. The British had gone after the Vichy naval base at Oran. There was obviously the incident at Dakar. There was the incident at Mers El Kabir, where the British and the French exchanged. And then there was the Renault the Renault factory outside of Paris. The Renault factory, once Paris and France were occupied by the Germans, Renault began building trucks for the German military. And the British decided that they would bomb this factory outside of Paris. And well, we know the British idea of precision bombing was somewhat questionable. So there were a lot of French casualties. There was and the incidents at Oran, Dakar, Merzekabir, more than anything, it was a bruise to French pride. There's a quote, and this was actually one of the resistance people that were in Morocco. He was quoted as saying, "If the British come, I will pick up a rifle and shoot until I am killed. If the Americans come, I will welcome them with open arms." So the French very much respect loyalty. They're they value loyalty. And Pétain was their leader, whether they liked it or not. Vichy was their government, whether they liked it or not. And we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about the Murphy-Wagon Accord. The United States, by this point in time, was actually sending food and medical supplies to French North Africa. So the French in North Africa are like, well, the Americans are the ones that are sending us food, so we're kind of cool with that. But what's interesting, and what's very interesting about this particular decision, this particular point in time, is you can look at September, October, November 1942 is the point in time where the British take the superpower torch and hand it to the Americans. Operation Torch is the first American-led major operation of World War II. And after that, the British really never take command again. Eisenhower, they're under the Americans from that point forward. That is really the point in time where America becomes the superpower. And it's kind of an interesting thing to ponder. All right. We're sticking together. So one of the things that's a quandary for us is that French North Africa, Vichy France, is a government that we officially recognize and is technically a declared neutral. So by invading Morocco and Algeria, we are technically attacking a neutral country. And Eisenhower writes about this in his memoirs. And he is very much at a quandary. He doesn't know, he understands the military necessity of it, but he also is like, he views it with considerable distaste. So that's it, So we have this idea. Maybe if we go into French Morocco and Algeria with somebody, an important Frenchman, at the head of our invasion, it's not an invasion. We're not invading, we're invited guests. So they start looking around going, who can we use? Well, obviously the girl's out. Because if you think about it, the Vichy consider him a traitor. And he looks at all the French officers who went over to Vichy as cowards. And actually Eisenhower writes about this extensively in his memoirs. And I think this is really a great quote, is the officers The French officers under Vichy chose not to think of themselves in that light. They considered themselves loyal Frenchmen carrying out the orders of the constituted civilian authority, and followed the people officially and personally regarded as a deserter. So it's interesting that one half of the French military thinks the other half of the French military is either a coward or a deserter. And so, as we get into this, it just gets a mess. So I want to talk a little bit about these two guys, just for some background. Charles Monroe, he's the French Governor General of North Africa. He is a very loyal Frenchman, and he will do whatever the constituted authority tells him to do. His goal, in his mind, his goal is to keep French North Africa French. He doesn't want the Germans in there, and he definitely doesn't want the British in there, he really doesn't want the Americans in there. He thinks that French North Africa just should stay French, and everybody should leave us alone and let us just be French. Then the Sultan, Sidi Mohammed bin Yusuf, he's the Sultan of the area. The way it's set up under the French government is that the Governor General, you'll see that he survives, because here he is up there with Mark Clark. He's one of these guys that somehow manages to just bounce back and forth from side to side, ends up smelling like roses at the end of the day. But he's responsible for the economic, political, and military aspects of French Morocco. The Sultan is responsible for the religious well-being of his people. And it is actually very interesting, once again, a rabbit hole you could go down, is this is actually an indication, this is actually a place in time where Sharia law was enforced. But it's not the version that we see now. It's actually very interesting, it's a very interesting kind of the way that the Jewish population and the Muslim population interact with each other. It's a very interesting, and it's one of the things that the Americans, when we come in that we kind of bump into that confuses us. But so these are both very important people. And you can see they both come out pretty already when they're being decorated by the victors on both sides. So Diplomat Among Warriors. If anybody ever get a chance to read this book, Robert Murphy. Robert Murphy is a very, very important player in this. Anybody here know Robert Murphy? Anybody ever heard the name before? James Bond, be damned, right?
Yeah.
This guy's right. This guy's really good. So he's the State Department expert on North Africa. He is, you have to bear in mind, at this point in time, the American State Department is a kind of infant status. And he's one of the original career diplomats. This guy's been, after World War I, we suddenly found ourselves as a world power. He's in Germany and in France, and then he's in Vichy. Roosevelt calls him back to Washington and basically says, Robert, you're going to North Africa, and you're going to go there, and you're going to be my personal eyes and ears on the continent in French North Africa. You do not report to the State Department. You report directly to me. Robert Murphy's a little confused by this, and he goes to the State Department and he talks to his bosses there, and they're like, yeah, that's how Franklin is, just follow your orders. So now we're back to Wagon. He's now over there in North Africa, and he's the delegate general. And the Germans don't like him there. They don't trust him.
No wonder.
So they try, and he gets called back to Vichy a couple times, and he manages to smooth talk his way out back into France, and chit-chats. But Robert Murphy and Wigan get together, and they create what's called the Murphy-Wigan Accord. It's an economic agreement. It kind of sounds like some things are going on now. It unfroze French assets and American banks, partially lifted the British blockade, allowed the delivery of consumer goods to North Africa, and it created 12 vice consul positions under Murphy. And their job was to be spread out throughout North Africa and make sure that the stuff we were delivering there didn't get put back on a ship and either get sent to Vichy or get sent to Germany. But the most important part of the Murphy-Wigan Accord is a margin note. There's literally written in the margin of the document that allowed these 12 vice consuls to use diplomatic pouches to communicate, which kept the Germans from looking at it. These 12 men were spies. This whole arrangement made the State Department incredibly uncomfortable. They really, really did. They were very, very uncomfortable about this. But it is what it is. And since we're told they were called the Apostles, and they came up with the best code names for people. They had their contacts were like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They had some really awesome code names.
Were they State Department people or are they people from themselves?
They're people from outside. We're going to talk about one of them. So these are the guys. These are our 12 apostles. David Brewster King, Noel Thomas Reed. These two guys become very, very important. You know, what's interesting is they start out as like best buddies, but they're both very, 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 very competitive guys. So then they start competing with each other, and eventually Murphy has to separate them because they just become so tied up in one another. A couple of these guys end up getting thrown out of North Africa for doing weird things. Pendar also becomes important. He's in the right parish to this, John Utter. We had those guys in Algiers, and we had some guys in Iran. So they kind of bounce around. They'll become important. You'll see in a couple of minutes where we're going. So just for fun, let's look at this one. We'll look at one of the 12 apostles. There's David Brewster King. Character. Another guy. I mean, this guy here, you read, it's just astounding. This guy was amazing. So he's a Harvard student. He leaves Harvard to join the French Foreign Legion to fight in World War I before the Americans entered the war. Once the Americans enter, he joins the United States Army. He's wounded multiple times. And then he becomes this vagabond that bounces around Africa, India, Afghanistan, and he amasses an impressive collection of ex-wives. Which is absolutely astounding.
In other words, he puts all our views to shame.
Yeah. Yeah, he's the real deal. I mean, if you read what these guys are like, they're like stealing 1936 DeSotos and gas from the Vichy French, and they're going around out into the back. Because there's a lot of, one of the things is that there's a lot of thought that the Spanish were going to invade, the Spanish were massing troops in Spanish Morocco to invade French Morocco. So these guys they're going out along that border in the desert, and they're driving around trying to see if they can spot Spanish troop movements, and they're up in the hills, they're crossing over into Spanish Morocco. You know, they get caught and they weasel their way out of things. It is absolutely incredible the things that were going on there. I mean, we could talk about them just for a day.
Really?
But the Germans, look at these 12 apostles, because none of these people are politicians, none of these people are military. They are just people that get recruited by Murphy. And the Germans call them the perfect picture of the wild conglomeration called the United States. Naturally lacking method, organization, and discipline, and will give us no trouble. And it would merely be a waste of paper to describe a person's idiosyncrasies and characteristics. So the Germans didn't think very highly of them. At the beginning, he did Murphy. Murphy was like, who the hell did they send me? Because they were all very much like Mr. King, just adventurers, mercenaries. But one of the things that Reed and King are assigned to do is to look at Casablanca Harbor. Because
Sean Bart.
The Jean Bart. But one of the things they do is they start making friends with people in the harbor, they make friends with the mechanics, they make friends with the dock workers, they find out what goes on in each and every one of these buildings, they find out that the Jean Bart is actually being worked on, and that the French are trying to get it up and running. They find out that there's German U-boats that are coming into the Casablanca harbor for maintenance. So they learn all of the things that are going on in here, and they make note of it, they send it back, and they're reporting on it religiously. So shortly after the Murphy-Wagon Accord, the Germans succeed in getting Wagon pulled out of North Africa, and he retires. And then French Admiral I got really got to work my French, but he replaces him. Anybody know William Eddy?
I've heard the name, that's as far as it went.
William Eddy is a United States Marine Corps veteran of the First World War. I think he's best summed up with a quote from when Patton meets him finally. Patton refers to him as the son of a bitch that should be shot at him. He's another one of these guys. He is full of shrapnel from the First World War. He's got a perpetual twitch in one of his eyes from a head wound. But he is one of the very first members of what would come to be called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. Precursor to our lovely CIA now. But he is one of the original OSS members, and he is sent to North Africa. And he takes over what is called the Apostles. So the Apostles, reporting to Murphy, are also reporting to Eddy together, and they are now all OSS operatives. So we now have these 12 guys who are in place, because they thought it would make no sense to start a whole other organization, so they went in there and he fell in on what Murphy had already built. And so all of these guys are now OSS operatives. And they do some very easy stuff. I want to talk real briefly here about the Germans. And you've all seen the movie Casablanca. I wonder who they modeled the German model. So these guys were technically the German Armistice Commission. So and there's a bunch of them, but there's two head guys. This guy here is General Paul Schulteis. And then there's Theodor Auer, who I for life could not find a picture of. What's interesting is that Theodor Auer knew Robert Murphy from his time in Berlin. And when they ran into each other in North Africa, neither one of them had any illusions as to what the other one was doing there. And they actually, Auer invited Murphy to lunch, they had lunch together, were trying to convince each other to stay out of each other's business. But it's very interesting. But one of the things that happens is the German Armistice Commission, while Wagon is in North Africa, just does civilian clothing. They're out and they just kind of blend in. When Wagon leaves, the German Armistice Commission the very next day shows up in uniform. They're all out in uniform, they've got the German flag flying, and Auer was actually Gestapo. So he's the Gestapo guy in Casablanca, which is interesting. If you try to Google to find a picture of him, they bring up the guy from the movie Casablanca. And I say, no, I want the real guy, but I could not find a picture of him the same way.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
So when Wagon departs, one of the big contacts becomes this Dubril guy. And he's not in Casablanca, he's actually in Algeria. And he leads a group that's called the Group of Five. And outwardly he's pro-fascist. Well, he is actually pro-fascist. He wants to install a government similar to Vichy, a more authoritarian regime. And what's interesting is that they all kind of come together. These authoritarian guys who were maybe a little bit fascist, but didn't like the Germans, and the monarchists and the communists and the Free French, and they're all kind of mixing together. You never really know who's on what side of the fence. But he couldn't, the Gaullists can't stand this guy, and they label him as a collaborator. He hates the Free French, and he wants, this authoritarian regime to come in. But he convinces Murphy that it's all a front and that he's really anti-German, which is true. He is anti-German, but he's definitely more on the right side of the fence than the center. And so he convinces Murphy to support him in Algeria. And so one of the things is, so out of all of these meetings, one of the names that gets thrown out is Giraud. So he was captured by the Germans in 1948. What's interesting is he's another fascinating period. He's captured by the Germans in World War I. He escapes from the Germans, goes back to fight with the French. He's wounded a bazillion times. In World War II, he's captured by the Germans. They send him to the Fortress Königstein, which was where they sent all the French officers. And he ties a bunch of sheets together and rappels down the side and gets out. And the Germans are like really mad at him because the Germans put a price on his head. He goes back to Vichy and goes to Pétain and tries to tell them that, we need to, stop cozying up to the Germans, and the Vichy are like, you're go away, you're making things bad. He didn't like de Gaulle at all, so he becomes like the lead Frenchman who really is not liked by anybody. He has no connections to anything. I guess one of the sad things about Giraud is that when he escapes from the Germans, prior to that, the Germans had been doing some prisoner exchanges for those 1.5 million POW, the French POWs. After Giraud escapes, they stop doing that. Because so basically they punish, whatever was left of that 1.5 million POW for Giraud's transgressions. They also go into occupied France and they arrest 17 members of his family who sort of vanish. So, he's an interesting guy. So they come up with this idea, and there's two different stories depending on what source you believe. One story says is that Le Brieux recommended Giraud. Another story says that Giraud contacted General Mast, who was in France, who was in Königstein with him, who had made his way back to Morocco somehow, and said, contact the Americans and tell them I'm interested in joining them. So it depends on which story you want to believe. There's two different versions of it based on their sources. And Eisenhower refers to one of the most distressing interviews of the war. Giraud ends up getting sent to Gibraltar, where he meets with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower and Mark Clark are saying, hey, when we land in France, you take control of the French military forces. And Giraud's like, no, this is a French thing, I'm going to be in charge. And they're like, no, that's not going to happen. And the sad thing is that this all goes on, the invasion fleet is already at sea. And there's just this quibbling back and forth about it. It's kind of crazy. So we're going to kind of go back in time a little bit. October 22nd, 1942. Once again, back to James Bond stuff. General Mark Clark and an entourage of a couple other Allied generals come in to Algiers via submarine, where they meet up with Murphy, who takes them to meet with General Charles Mast to discuss the invasion. They basically tell Mast that the Americans are planning to attack French North Africa. Mast thinks next year, 1943, and in reality, they're talking like 14 days. So So and this is another great story. These guys, they come by submarine, they row in on the little folding kayaks, like four generals and the State Department guy, and they come up on the beach, they meet with Mast in some beachfront villa, and while they're there, the French police show up because somebody reported all the footprints in the sand on the beach, and they thought there were smugglers in the area, and they were trying to, crack down on the black marketers. Little did they know in the wine cellar, there's like the American general, the command staff of the American invasion is hanging in the wine cellar. And then they rush to leave Algiers before the tides are right, and they end up losing their Gazette bag of all their papers, and it sinks to the bottom. And somewhere off the coast there, apparently Mark Clark had a money belt with a bunch of gold coins in it, and that is somewhere at the bottom. So I guess we could go look for that. So they're going in and out via submarine. But what's very interesting is that at this point, they come aboard the HMS Seraph. And the HMS Seraph is interesting because it also was the USS Seraph. Because it brought Girard to Gibraltar. And Girard refused to go aboard a British vessel. So they had to put an American captain on board, they reflagged the USS, and then Girard would get on board and leave France. So they tell the French, invasion is imminent. They believe just a vast amount of confusion. Anybody ever heard of Lieutenant Colonel McGowan? So, and this we're going to walk back on September 1942. Murphy goes to Washington and gets briefed on what's going on. And they tell him about the invasion. They give him, he's one of the few people that knows what's happening. He decides that he needs to go talk to Eisenhower, because Eisenhower is going to lead up the invasion. But at this point in time, Murphy's a household name, and if he would arrive in London, probably would have stirred up some controversy. So they gave him papers that identified him as a Lieutenant Colonel McGowan. And General Marshall gave him this identity, and with the caveat that said no one pays any attention to Lieutenant Colonels. So he goes into England as Lieutenant Colonel McGowan. While he's there, somebody recognizes him, and so they have to arrest this guy, and they lock him up until after the invasion is over because they don't want, well, if you didn't see him, once again, great, there's a lot of great side stories. But he briefs Eisenhower on Africa, for everything from the climate to the political landscape to the resistance operations. And what's interesting is one of the things that comes out of this is one of the things Eisenhower asked him is like, do we really need to issue winter underwear to the troops? And Murphy's like, yeah, it gets cold there at night. And so one of the reasons why the American invasion force was issued the winter underwear is because Murphy told him he should. But he was told specifically not to tell anybody else about the invasion until 4 days before it was to happen. So, we have Darlan. We'll talk a little bit about Darlan. Darlan was the French admiral, five-star French admiral. He bounced back and forth between being the second and third in command of the Vichy. He was, for a while, Laval, we talked about a little earlier, Laval was ousted. Darlan was second in command. Then Laval made his way back in. So at the time of the invasion, Darlan was the overall supreme commander of the Vichy armed forces, what there was of the Vichy armed forces. And so the Darlan incident is a curious upshot of highly fortunate complications, according to Churchill. And there he is. Darlan is probably one of the most hated people in Europe at this point in time. And he is an unabashed, definitely an unabashed opportunist. So time Vichy second, so he was Vichy second commander, and then he bumped out, but now he is the supreme commander of the French military. So he was in North Africa doing an inspection of the troops. And he had a son that had polio. And his son was in Algiers. He was sent there for the climate, to try and help. So Darlan decided, rather than return to France, he was going to stop in Algiers and see his kid. And so he is actually, so this happens like right as the invasion is about to break. So now we have the supreme commander of the French military forces in theater at the time the Americans are preparing to land. And so you have all of this work that Murphy has done with his resistance cells, and they're really like these French officers, like disobeying Juin or Mast or a subordinate commander is one thing, but disobeying the supreme commander is another. Remember, the French are very, very well. So this is our landing. Where was your father? Where was your father at? And he'd be over here somewhere, right?
It ended up in the Algiers area, Algeria, you're
He
right.
was somewhere in here. Here's the First Army. So really, this is what the Americans were proposing, and these are the things the British wanted done. This task force sailed directly from Hampton Roads, Virginia, and then these task force came from England. And over here, and what's interesting is all this stuff is going on with Girard arguing with Eisenhower over who's going to be in command, and then Darlan appears, and Murphy is desperately saying, we need to postpone this invasion by 2 weeks. We need to figure out what the hell's going on here. And they're like, we've got 102 ships with 33,000 men sailing over here in submarine-infested waters. You can't just have them cruise around in circles for 2 weeks. That's just not going to happen. And then then 4 days before the invasion, Murphy goes around and starts telling the French, say, hey, this is what's happening. And there's French commanders, over in Oran, where like, well, you know what? If your troops land here, I'll tell the garrison commander. But they're like, no, the invasion is already going on. This is happening. We're not changing landing beaches and altering things. And once again, this is like our first major amphibious operation of this variety in the world. We made a ton of mistakes, but somehow it all came out. So we got Patton over here and Freehold and Ryder. And then of course, the German response over here. So Operation Torch goes off November 8th, 1942. 107,000 men total, 32,000 of them traveling from the United States in the theater, the rest of them from England down. Eisenhower is the commander. Unfortunately, while this is all happening, Eisenhower and Mark Clark are in Gibraltar arguing with Girard over exactly who's going to be in charge of what. But the landings went on. The Western Task Force, under Patton, the Central Task Force, the First Armored First Ranger, including Ed's dad. And the Eastern Task Force, coming aboard on the Ryder, who will become an important player a little bit later too. So, you've all seen The Longest Day, right? They have the resistance guys sitting around the radio, the chairs against the wall, Jean had a long moustache. Well, shortly before midnight, BBC broadcasts a little bit. Murphy is sitting in front of his radio, and he hears this, and he's like, crap, I'm on. Time for me to get in my car and start going around. Because that was the signal that the invasion was coming. So the first first thing that Murphy does is he gets into his car and goes to visit General Green, and says, he is supposed to be the highest ranking military officer in North Africa. Unfortunately, Darlan is still there. And there he is, all his medals, looking very, very dapper. So he's roused from his sleep and informed his country's about to be attacked. He's a little irritated by this. Just a little annoyed. Apparently, according to Murphy's memoirs, they went to his house, banged on his doors, and he comes out in his silk pajamas, looking kind of with his hair all kind of out of order, like, what the hell do you want? And his question was, who invited the Americans? And Murphy looked at him and said, Gerard. And he was kind of, who the hell is he? What's he got to do with it? But he's like, you know what? I am not the commander. He was very anti-German, but he's like, hey, Darlan's just up the damn road. I got to go talk to him. And this is in Algiers. And kind of another one of those interesting things. So Murphy and they all go to visit Darlan. And then there's another one of these great incidents that happens. In Algiers, the resistance actually did what it was supposed to do. All of the work that Murphy and the apostles and the OSS guys did worked in Algiers. The resistance cells got up, they went out, but unfortunately, one of the things they did was surround Darlan's residence. So Murphy's in there with Jules, and they're having this powwow, and then they're like, and Darlan's like, we need to send a telegram to Vichy, I need instructions. And they go to the telegraph office, and they realize that the resistance had surrounded Montreal. And so so Murphy gives the telegram to one of the resistance guys, or to one of the subordinates, who's supposed to go out and send it to Vichy, and he ends up not sending it. And then shortly after, the French military police find out that Darlan has been taken prisoner by the resistance. They show up, and they retake the residency, and they grab Murphy, and they're about to execute him. And Darlan's like, no, we might need him. So right before they're about to shoot him, in the garden, they come on, maybe you don't want to shoot him. Let's wait a minute. The exact opposite happened in Casablanca. In Casablanca, the resistance stood up, and unfortunately, their timing was off. They thought the invasion was going to start at 5, but the invasion had been pushed back by an hour. So they showed up at the Governor General's quarters and said, they launched a military coup. And then they're standing there waiting for the Americans to come, and then they realize the Americans didn't come because they were off by an hour. And so the French turned around and arrest all of them and throw them in jail, which is why at the end the French in Casablanca actually resist. And that's where you go back to the Jean Bart. The Jean Bart comes out and with its one working turret engages the Massachusetts. It's hopelessly outclassed and ends up getting blown back into the harbor, where the French then fix it again and start shooting at the Americans again, and finally the aircraft from the Ranger finally sink it. But the French Navy in Casablanca came out, fought incredibly bravely. And
I don't think they sank it, Chris. I think that it was damaged to the point where it couldn't operate.
It was damaged, but then they came back, and the ships and the aircraft from the Ranger actually sank it at the pier.
Oh, okay. Because
the French they jammed the turret, and then the French fixed the turret and began shooting again.
Yeah,
and the Americans were like, you know what? Well, we had enough of your nonsense. So what then happens? It kind of goes back and forth, and so Darlan gives Murphy his limousine, and says, you know what, you need to go down to the beach and find the American commanding general. This fellow here, the General Charles W. Ryder, and bring him back, and we're going to talk about a ceasefire. And so Murphy heads down to the beach, and what's interesting is the first officer he runs into is actually British. It actually turns out to be Churchill's son. And he's like, hey, where's Ryder? They end up going back, and they have this little powwow, and they come up with a ceasefire. So then Mark Clark finally arrives with Girard, and they say, French, stop shooting, and the French are like, man, we don't know who the hell you are, go away. You know, and then Eisenhower, terrific blow to our expectations. So on the other side of the Mediterranean, all this stuff is starting to make its way across. The Germans are like, okay, Vichy needs to fight. What are you guys going to do? And they start offering support, and the Vichy they start to kind of collaborate, and the Germans come across from Sicily and occupy part of Tunisia. And on November 8th, late in the evening, the Vichy cabinet meets and they officially break diplomatic ties with the United States. So technically, the United States and Vichy France are at war. On November 10th, the Germans instituted Attila and began occupying Vichy. So this was all the news that Darlan needed. Darlan found out that the Germans were occupying, and were like, you know what? I'm throwing my head in with you guys. He ordered a ceasefire, but he would not order an armistice. He didn't think he had the authority to order an armistice. And that's where it kind of becomes, it becomes incredibly confusing. But the ceasefire worked on Darlan's orders. All of West Africa, including Dakar, North Africa, stopped fighting. In Toulon, rather than risk being taken by the Germans, because they didn't think they could get their fleet underway quick enough or make it out of the Mediterranean fast enough, so they scuttled the entire French fleet.
Is there a movie about that? Is there a movie about that where they scuttle their fleet? Nothing comes to mind? Okay. But I saw it.
And there's a German who realized, God, they're just a little too late. But to gain these ends, Mark Clark and Eisenhower, and then later Eisenhower, entered into a deal with Darlan that militarily made a lot of sense. But politically, I mean, you just signed a deal with the devil. And on November 11th, Eisenhower met with Darlan and made it official. So technically, and then the Governor General in Casablanca signs an armistice at that same time with Patton. And one of the reasons this all kind of goes down is that Eisenhower is really, really afraid that all of this inner French confusion and back and forth and squabbling is that at some point the indigenous population of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, all the Moors and the Muslims that are going to be like, hey, these guys are really in disarray. This is the time for revolution. And Eisenhower didn't want to deal with that. And one of the things is that it's interesting is that Girard arrives in North Africa, and he's there for 2 days, surveys the political landscape, and he's like, no, I'm good. I'll be the military commander, Darlan can be the political guy. And so Patton signs an armistice with the Governor General in Casablanca on the 11th. He had arrived in theater with 2 pre-written armistices. One assumed that the French would not fight and just give up, and the other assumed that the Americans had soundly militarily defeated the French and were prepared to occupy. What happened was something in the middle. So Patton, in true Patton fashion, rewrites his own armistice that sort of splits the difference. But It shows that he's really wasn't a dumb guy, because he realized that he had to allow the French to surrender with some level of honor, and that 33,000 men was not enough to do a full-on occupation of French Morocco. So he did what he did post-war with the Germans, is he allowed the French to kind of keep running things and allowed them to kind of retain some honor. And again, he didn't really get much, because that was overshadowed what was going on in Algeria with Darlan. So yeah, it's short, he wanted no part of it. He's like, no, these people are crazy. So he agreed to serve as military leader under Darlan. Mark Clark wrote this in his diary that night before he went to bed. A mess, why do soldiers get mixed up in things like this when there's a war he fought? So, what happens is that we put Darlan as the political leader of the French colonies, and with Giraud as the military person director below him. This becomes a huge political hot potato. Winston Churchill writes anything for the battle, but the politics will have to be sorted out later on. You know, this guy was a notorious collaborator, was an opportunist. Harold Nicholson, who was a parliamentarian, disgraceful but most profitable episode. And even Goebbels wrote about it in his diary. I mean, there was a lot about going about this. And as can be expected, de Gaulle was not pleased at all. Great quote. De Gaulle's a real character. So obviously Churchill had told him about the invasion basically the night before, and it was way too late for him to do anything about it. The Darlan episode was incredibly unpopular already, so the Gaullist press machine goes into full force. You know, Darlan was a traitor, collaborator, and had to be removed. And I don't know if it was true to Darlan, I think it was the Governor General, left a lot of the Nazi-inspired or Vichy-inspired race laws in place. There was a lot of stuff that was going on, because some of these guys were kind of rightish. So this guy then shows up in Algeria, General Vichy, December 19th, 1942. He shows up and shows up in Algiers, and he was the Gaullist liaison, and he wanted to meet with the monarchists and to force Darlan to advocate. And then, by coincidence, on December 24th, 1942, Darlan is assassinated. And Giraud finds himself in the place he didn't want to be. He's in charge. And nobody was really sure if anybody would even pay attention to what he said. So that brings us up to the events of 75 years ago today. The Casablanca Conference. Churchill and Roosevelt are meeting on North Africa, right on the back step of the Axis. Adolf and Mussolini in there. Told you about the plan.
That kind of reminds me of the old political cartoons by Hobart.
Yeah. So Churchill and Roosevelt meet in Casablanca. Giraud was there. Churchill really thought de Gaulle should be there. And Roosevelt kind of gives in and realizes that de Gaulle is gaining power and popularity, and at some point they would have to address what exactly, what role he was going to play and what we're going to do with him. De Gaulle was like, no, you guys didn't invite me to the party to begin with, I'm not going to come. He was insulted. He insulted his French honor. So Churchill keeps sending him telegrams, saying, look, you gotta come, you gotta come, you gotta come. No. So finally on 18th January, Churchill sends him a telegram and said, "You come, or I'm going to tell everybody that you were invited and refused, and we're going to make you look like an idiot. And we're going to pick somebody else." And so de Gaulle understood, if nothing else, de Gaulle understood public opinion, and so he shows up. And de Gaulle and Girard shake hands.
It's a great picture.
Yeah, there's really, I wonder what they're saying to each other. There's Churchill smiling in the background there.
Yeah.
He probably got the shotgun in his
And I think there's a grin on Roosevelt's face too.
Yeah. I don't know, Roosevelt never really did see eye to eye with him. But Girard ends up being discredited. The Free French, the Gaullists, managed to label him as a pro-communist. He goes back to Algiers and retires. He waits for some of the allies to come and save him, and they don't. They just kind of like, whatever, we're just let it all run. And he writes Girard writes an impasse where France is forever, and kind of fades away into obscurity. Because he does a MacArthur, before MacArthur did MacArthur. Walter Lippmann was a reporter. He wrote for Time magazine, and he wrote this kind of fitting. Is that Mr. Roosevelt's desire to thwart General de Gaulle has led to the destruction of General Girard, with greater divisions rather than greater unity. This is inefficiency of the conduct of diplomacy. It's probably not wrong. So Churchill kind of summed it up. Even when behaving badly and seemed to express personal offense, a great nation lost pride, authority, and ambition. So at the end of it, what really kind of came out of all this is, de Gaulle ends up being de Gaulle. I mean, everybody knows who he is now. This really kind of flavored. This is the point where, like, the United States and France kind of diverged a little bit, and the French under de Gaulle always remembered the way Franklin treated him. And then we did a lot of goofy stuff too, is that we were very anti-colonialism, so we did some things to undermine the French colonial, and we did some stuff in 43 and then post-war, and it kind of really tinged the post-war relationship between the United States and the French. But at the end of the day, we won. In 1956, Morocco became independent, and then Algiers, in 1960 was Algiers, after a very, very bloody insurgent war conflict. So it's a great story, and people kind of long, but there's so many, like I said, and there's some great books. I wanted to point out, this book here actually just came out last year, and I haven't quite finished it yet. But this is an awesome book, and this book really goes into some of the rabbit holes about some of the stuff that's going on. It's brand new, it just came out.
Can you read us the title and the author?
It's Meredith Hindley, and it's called Destination Casablanca. And she really goes down into, she goes into detail about the activities of the 12 Apostles. She talks about some of the French dissidents that ended up in Casablanca, and there's some really crazy stuff that went on. And Robert Murphy's book, Diplomat Among Warriors, if you get a chance, that's a great book to read. He's a fascinating character. So, any questions?
A couple comments.
Okay.
One other thing with Vichy France and Free France, there was at least one naval battle between Free French and Vichy French warships out in the Gulf of Indochina area. As well, there was an incident later on in France, after the Normandy invasion, where a area of France rose up in favor of de Gaulle. And they did kick the Germans out, the German occupiers out of that area, but the Germans came back.
Yeah, there was a lot of craziness that went on.
And the problem with that,
The French are really kind of fascinating.
the problem with that was that what ended up happening is the Germans prevailed along with the Vichy French at that point. And that area was a hotbed against de Gaulle after the war.
Yeah.
There was definitely some internal strife in that area, and de Gaulle had to go back in there again and pacify it militarily.
In the beginning, when the Germans invaded, what was their plan? Did they plan to do exactly what they did, occupy northern France and just create a puppet government, South France and the colonies, or did they have to do that? I mean, what I don't understand is why they didn't completely come in and take over France and its colonies. They didn't have the manpower, they didn't want to do that, or...
Well, I don't know if they were able to take over the colonies, but it happened that you had these people, Reagan actually was one of them, and Pétain, that came together and suggested the armistice and said, hey, and they wanted to retain some of France's dignity, and I think the Germans were like, okay,
It would just seem to me that the Germans would have just come in there and unconditionally just taken it and defeated them and said, no, we're not going to. But I don't know, maybe they weren't able to do that, they defeated them.
I don't know if they had the ability, if they were able to do it.
No, they weren't.
They probably didn't have, but in either case, doing it the way they did it really kind of put the French colonial holdings into limbo for 3 years. And I think politically they were hoping they'd be able to sway them to come over.
That's what they're trying.
I think if Laval would have had his way, they would have. But
The Germans never had the manpower or the resources to completely take over that area.
Hitler wanted to go to Russia.
Yeah.
yeah,
He didn't care about,
yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of things. Yeah. But I think it was just one of those things that opportunity presented, and they're like, hey, we can do it this way. But it is, you talked about the French Navy, it is amazing that the French Navy was the one thing that really came out and fought. The French Navy came out at Casablanca, and the American Navy and the French Navy were really shooting at each other. The French Army sort of, there were a couple spots where they really fought, but there were also a couple spots.
And the British Navy and the French Navy went at it too.
Yeah.
Or with it, at least twice.
And it was also, the Operation Torch was definitely, we really had we were very, very, very careful about who we shot at. We didn't want to really anger the French or the indigenous population. We wanted them to come over to our side. So, I mean, the clock was ticking on Casablanca. Patton was ready to level Casablanca. They kept fighting. That's one of the reasons when Darlan and all those guys were really scrambling to get that ceasefire, because they realized that if Patton bombed Casablanca, that the probability was that the French were going to flop, and then the French would be at war with the United States. It's just, there's a lot of craziness and really kind of
But when you say the French, you're talking about the Vichy French.
right.
And what did they have? I mean, they had southern France and colonies that were in a world that's at war, in a sense. Where were they getting their money? Where were they getting their, who were they? As far, you say go to war with them, but were they able to really fight a war with anybody, being divided like they were? And I don't know.
But the real threat was if they would have gone over the German side.
Right.
and then taken whatever assets they still had and put it in with the Germans, including, up until it was scuttled on the 9th, a very, very modern fleet. I mean, the French fleet really had everybody terrified, because neither side wanted to see it on the other side. And in the end, it ended up at the bottom of the harbor.
The other thing with all of that too is that as Chris mentioned earlier, there was two factors involved. The French fleet was one, but the colonial military was the other. They had some very ferocious troops that was part of Morocco and Algiers. And they figured heavily during the North African campaign, as well as the Sicily and Italy.
And Syria. Good amount of troops in Syria.
Yeah.
Especially Morocco.
French Syria goes over to the German side. Next thing you know, you got the Germans attacking Egypt from both ends.
Chris, I'll say this, you did a very good presentation.
One final note.
I didn't mean to blabber that long.
Did Murphy and the apostles get out of there?
Yeah. And the sad thing is that, like, the OSS guys, once the Americans landed, they pretty much ignored them. They came to the American military and said, hey, we have all these recommendations, and they're like, yeah, go, we got this. So, but yeah, they were. Yeah.
You said your father landed in Algeria.
Yeah,
first time I came, my dad.
Oh, really?
You know that?